We are continuing the lectionary readings, but the sermons are not necessarily coinciding explanations and content around those. But I wanted to continue our lectionary readings even through the question series. But the question series is really just about whatever questions that were submitted. I got about between 14 and 18 questions that were submitted to me, and lots of different kinds. I tried to group them together accordingly. Last week we only got to one, I think it was. Yeah, just one. And this week we might get to two, because this is a bigger one. But it was a bigger question. But first I want to tell a story. Because I grew up kind of in that charismatic fundamentalist stream of Christianity. Like bring your own tambourine to church on Sunday kind of a stream. That was my stream in the Sunday morning. Like sometimes there would be like a tongues language spoken in this corner, and then everything would go quiet waiting for somebody over here to say, what did that mean? And then there would be an interpretation of it. The music was very lively. The pastor actually, he played piano a lot like Billy Joel. And he would do like he would just play piano, which was very different in the 80s to do like that. And they would do all those like modern contemporary songs of the time, like As the Deer and We Exalt Thee and all those kinds of things. Do you remember the overhead projector? I had the overhead projector where we didn't have like actual projection technology yet or big screens or anything like that. It was just a box that maybe you've seen them in your classrooms way back in the day. And then you had transparencies, and then you moved that piece of paper, the transparency, and it just took whatever was there, magnified it onto a screen. And so every now and then you would see someone's hand like come into the shadow and move the transparency to what part of the song you're on, and then they'd flip it over to another one. And there was like a file system up front of all the different transparencies of all the different songs. And you'd have to print them like on a Xerox style printer on these like see-through pieces of paper that you would put on the transparency thing and move it around. And that's how it was on a Sunday. I grew up that way. Very suburban Detroit area, like Redford was where I grew up, 8 Mile on Grand River. So it's about a mile from the city line of Detroit, but its own culture. Very suburban, kind of white, Christianish kind of a thing. That's when I grew up. I started going to college, and I grew up like, this is the way to do it. This is the only way that faith is to be practiced. This is it. And I went to college in Farmington Hills. William Tyndale College no longer exists, but that's another story. And I remember there's all these different kinds of professors there. They tried to show different perspectives. So I had a Pentecostal do my pneumatology class, which was a class about the Holy Spirit. And then I had a Baptist give my like a hermeneutics class where it was like how to study the Bible. And so it's just a broad, different perspectives. One of the classes I had was from an inner city black pastor from Detroit. And I tell you, like, learning all these different aspects of the faith was interesting, but that was something that was so foreign to me. I didn't understand it. And one day, we got to talking politics, and you know how you're going to get in trouble fast. You start mentioning anything political in any sphere at all. And this is back in the 90s, I think it was. Yeah, it was late 90s. And he had said some kind of words about how he votes Democrat every single election. And the entire class, their jaws went on the floor. They're like, how could you be a Christian and vote Democrat? I don't understand that. We could not understand this perspective at all. So that just shows you, illustrates the fact that for my entire upbringing, being a Christian and being a Republican were like this, right? And so that got me thinking along the lines like, when did that happen? I wonder when that happened. Because I don't think Jesus, like the Republican Party wasn't a thing when Jesus was around. Neither was the Democratic Party, right? Like it was different politics altogether in those days. So when did this happen? It's a very unique thing to our country. It's not a Christian thing. It is a very unique thing to American, evangelical, fundamentalist Christian thing that there's somehow in our history was a fusion of Christians and Republicans together to make one thing. Now, today is not a criticism of that, because I know that there are going to be Republicans in here, and there are going to be Democrats in here, and you're allowed to vote however you want to vote. This is a democracy, and you're allowed to do that, and I'm not here to tell you how to vote and who to vote for. That's not my job. I'm not a politician. I don't know all the different politics and economics, and so none of that makes sense to me. I don't get it. I'm a pastor, I'm not a politician. But when it comes to like the history of church and ethics and values and different things, I think there's some things to explore here, because there are some deep questions in our society that go overlooked in church spaces because we don't want to talk about the P word, the politics word. And so today we will be mentioning politics, but it will not be a critique of any kind of a system. This is just a how we got here kind of a thing. Because many younger people are becoming disillusioned with church because they don't hold the values of conservative Republican politics. And since Christianity has fused itself to it, then they think, I can't be either of those things. And so that's to preface this question. Somebody in the congregation asked this: Christians in our culture, political climate, are largely viewed more conservative. How can I be proud to be Christian when I do not share the views/beliefs of this group? That's an honest question. And that's a spiritual question. It's not really a political question. That's a spiritual question. And so I got to be careful today, because I want this to be a place for all people. But I also got to be very concise about how there was a fusing of these two things into one that makes a young person come to church and ask this question. But what if I'm not a conservative or a Republican? Can I still be a Christian? The answer is yes, yes. But their question is specifically, how can I be proud to be a Christian when I don't share the views? Because if you look at the evangelical church in America, about 82 to 84% traditionally vote Republican each election. And they're saying, that's not necessarily my value system, so how can I be proud to be identifying with this Christian group if they think and value different things than me? So this is a very honest question. Some of you are like shifting in your seats. You're like, oh boy, here we go. But what we're going to do today to answer this question is just to look at the history of how it happened so that we can untangle politics and faith to look at them separately. And it's okay if you still hold to Republican conservative values, but to separate those things from actual historic Christian doctrine, I think is very essential for the church going forward. So we're just going to do a quick history, not really quick. I'm just going to say it's not quick. We'll do a history lesson of how we got here. Because when I stood in that class, or when I sat in that classroom under that pastor, who was an inner city black man, and he said that he was a Democrat, and the entire class was like, that's impossible. Christians can't be Democrats. There is something that fed my mind and shaped my heart to be that way and think that way. Now, that was, good Lord, 25 years ago. And so I don't think those ways anymore, but at the time, I have been shaped to say there is no difference between the two. So, we'll start off with a statement, a quick statement. Okay, hold on here. Here we go. The last 100 years in American history has shaped the definition of Christian in ways that have not necessarily been historic Christianity, and it's helpful to know these shifts so that you can find your place. Now, this is very important distinctions to make. We have to untangle the two so that you know which is which. Because when they're all tangled up and you can't tell which is which, then it gets real messy real fast. So you have to tell which are which. So in the last 100 years, we have made so many strides in science and archaeology and textual studies, astronomy, physics. All of these things expanded our worldview. Like just 100 years ago, we thought the galaxy, the whole universe, was just as big as the Milky Way. And it wasn't until Edwin Hubble calculated the distance to the Andromeda Nebula, and he was like, wait, that's outside of our Milky Way. That's another galaxy. And then he's like, well, what about that one? Oh, that's another galaxy. That's another galaxy. So our universe has been getting bigger and bigger. It is just within this last 100 years that we went from outhouses to indoor plumbing. We went from the Rural Electrification Act took root, and electricity came to our rural homes just in the last 100 years, maybe even 80 years. When I do funerals, I often find something in the year to say, in that year, this, and this happened, to just kind of put the context of their birth year. There's been a couple, it's like, oh, that's when they brought electricity to farmhouses in rural areas, when this person was born, so that just happened really soon. Like refrigerators, Walmart. There's people in this room that you remember canning your own food from grandma. Like that's how you got the majority of your food, was growing it in your garden and preserving and canning. And now we have grocery stores, and that is kind of going by the wayside, right? Like this has all happened in the last 100 years. Monumental shifts have happened, and religious controversies intertwined themselves with political controversies over the last 100 years, so that it became difficult to distinguish the differences between the two. Thus, it led to polarization, culture wars, and pursuits of political power from either side aiming at each other. So that's kind of how it happened. Now, let's rewind a little bit of time here. This is Princeton. This is a seminary. It's a theological seminary, actually. But the fundamentalists in 1890 to 1920 had a response because something kind of big happened in the late 1800s. His name was Darwin. Anybody remember that name? And he wrote a book about evolution. And that broke our science as we knew it. To say that we have evolved, things have evolved, and over a long period of time was brand new. And scientists started to look into this and say, this guy's got a point. And now scientists are saying, yeah, there's somehow, some kind of evolution has happened to bring about how we are. Thank you, Chris. That's getting hot in here. So, what do churches do in the 1890s for that? Well, there was something called the fundamentalist response. And the British and the American churches divided in response to this new science of evolution. And some churches that were more mainline Protestant, they were like, yeah, that makes sense. We need to start adjusting our theology to match the science that is being handed to us, that humanity is discovering. And then there is the other side that was like, no, we need to resist this change. We need to resist this science. And so in 1900 to 1910, Princeton Theological Seminary took essays from all these theologians, and they drafted a doctrine, brand new, called the doctrine of inerrancy. And the doctrine of inerrancy said it was a response to these modernists, these pastors that are kind of open to this new science that's coming out. And it was in response to them saying, no, you're wrong. And they said this: the Bible is divinely inspired, religiously authoritative, and without error, and should be read differently than any other historical document. That's what they said at Princeton. And they believed that modernism led people to hell. And from here, what happened was the fundamentalists started to rally up together, and they're like, we have a response that we have to do. We have to start, name the things that we're going to hold to like none other. And they came up with the 5 pillars of fundamentalism. So the 5 pillars of fundamentalism, they drafted 5 pillars that were, they called them essential to Christian faith. And these 5 pillars then defined American, conservative, evangelical, and fundamental theology for the next century. And here's those 5 pillars. 1, the Bible is the inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture. And they say that the Bible is without errors in matter, including history and science. So they grouped those into there. So they started to say the Bible is divinely inspired and without error, religiously authoritative, but then the fundamentalists threw in there also in the areas of history and science. So they threw those 2 things in there and said, if you believe in evolution, then you cannot be a Christian. If you believe that the earth is not, that's millions of years old, back then they did, then you cannot be a Christian. If you believe that the history that our historians have is different from the history that the Bible has, you cannot be a Christian. That's the number one thing. They put that one first above all. And this was a response to evolution. That was the evolutionary science discoveries that were happening. The second one was the virgin birth of Christ. And the virgin birth of Christ, they said he was conceived by the Holy Spirit, not a human father, and that affirms that Christ was divine and sinless and perfect. The third one was the death of Christ was an atonement for humanity's sin. And what they did with this one was they took the 5 different views of what happened at the cross. There was 5 theological views. And they said the other 4 will lead you to hell. There's only one that works. And so they brought the one called substitutionary atonement over into here and said it's essential to be a Christian that you have to believe in this way of the atonement. There was 4 others. We don't have time to talk about the others. But there was others at the time, and they rejected those and said, no, those lead you to hell. This is the one you have to believe in. The 4th one is the bodily resurrection of Christ, because that affirms the Christian hope and a heavenly afterlife. And then the final one was the historical reality of Christ's miracles. So they affirmed the historicity of the Bible and the divinity of Christ and all that. So what happened here with the fundamentalist 5 pillars is faith shifted its emphasis and lost its nuance. This is something that happened in right around 1910 to 1920. It lost nuance. So fundamentalists enshrined literal, historical, and individual readings of the scriptures above allegorical, spiritual, and communal readings of the scriptures. And actually both sets of values are found in the Bible, but they pulled those 3 out, historical, literal, individual, and said those are now all of the scriptures. And none of the scriptures about allegorical, spiritual, or communal readings of it, they're not really that important. So it starts as a movement out of Princeton Theological Seminary, and then this guy comes along, Lyman Stewart. He was a wealthy oil millionaire, and he funded the publication of pamphlets that supported these 5 fundamentals. And those who embraced this theology were called the fundamentalists. And it became, these 5 things became the, quote, battle lines of conservative religion, drawing a line in the sand between modernists and conservative belief, as well as urban and rural value systems. And so this guy kind of took all of those 5 fundamentals, he put them in pamphlets, he funded it himself, and then he spread them across the country to kind of say, yes, these are the things. So fundamentalism exists because of a wealthy oil millionaire. I guess you could say that, because he funded everything. So then came the 1920s. Let's do a quick timeline here. 1920s, that's when Einstein's theory of relativity came out and changed physics. And when Hubble discovered the first galaxy outside of our Milky Way, changed our cosmology. Darwin's evolutionary theory is expanding scientific knowledge. And one science teacher in Tennessee was sued by some parents and probably the state for teaching evolution in his high school science class. That was this guy here. His last name was Scopes. Have you ever heard of the Scopes monkey trial? Okay, Scopes monkey trial was a big thing in the 1920s. It made news everywhere because there was a law in Tennessee that banned the teaching of evolution in science classes. You were not allowed to do that in science classes. They overturned that law in 1967. That's a long time away. But in the 1920s, that was there. He was found guilty and fined $100, which would have been close to $2,000 in today's money. So what happened there was the fundamentalists actually partnered with the government with things like evolution in schools and prohibition. Remember the Roaring 20s? And then all of a sudden, it was not okay to be a Christian and drink. The whole reason we have grape juice at communion is because of the prohibition. And churches needed a non-alcoholic communion option, because before that, everyone just did wine. And they're like, oh, Christians don't do alcohol. So the prohibition in America was actually headed up by the women's temperance movement of the 20s, and they partnered with government and said, we need to enshrine our morals, ethics, and values in government so that they are then enforced with people below. So the fundamentalists are like, yes, government is our friend. Sound weird today, doesn't it? But government is our friend to help us enforce our religious values upon society to make us into something more Christian. But then something happened in the 1930s. The 1930s saw the Great Depression, and FDR, he had a response that says, wow, a lot of people lost a lot of their livelihoods, their lives, their health, it was a horrible time in American history. So he did something called the New Deal response. And some fundamentalists believed that the expanding of the federal government was paving the way for this thing called the Antichrist, which was a evangelical fundamentalist. Evangelicals didn't exist yet, but the fundamentalist view of the end times that was brand new in there. And he says it elevates the government as a false savior and promotes communism instead of the free market capitalism that we all enjoy. So the fundamentalists shifted from partnership with big government to anti-government, you're overreaching, and they became what was known as pro-religious liberties and pro-free markets in response to the New Deal of FDR. Now in the 40s, something else happened. The evangelicals emerged. The evangelicals are saying, we're kind of harsh, y'all. We need something a little bit more tempered. Billy Graham comes out, he starts doing all of his crusades, but they are then open to science, they're open to like the academy and intelligence, like places like Fuller Theological Seminary were started at this time. And they were kind of against that anti-academy, anti-science, militant doctrinalism. And they became like active in society instead of withdrawn. And they were ecumenically open to partnerships. And they integrated social engagement with spiritual gospel. That's when Billy Graham started his crusades and everything in the 40s. Now, there's two things at play here. There's conservative value systems, which emphasizes individual freedoms, individual responsibility, and you pair that with Christian doctrines of individual sin and personal salvation, and they found like that matched like the rural lifestyle. So if you've ever seen like the voting maps about rural areas are red and urban areas are blue, like there's value systems in rural areas that are different than urban areas because of that. The modernist views, which became more of the urban responses, they emphasize social responsibility. They're surrounded by other people, like all over the place. They emphasize collective guilt, like, oh, we did that with this law and made this hurt these people. And they paired that with the Bible's understanding of systemic sin and social reform of the gospel. And so that brings us up to the 1950s. This is where a big shift happens in American society. The 1950s is a huge shift. So what happened in the 1950s? The post-World War II, the Cold War is happening. The Russians were communist and secular, and America looked at them as the big enemy. So the 50s, like that's when the Cold War really started, like fear of nuclear weapons, fear of Russia, fear of, like this whole Cold War thing was happening. And the US said, we need a response to secular communism of Russia so that we can win the Cold War. And so what they did was they said, we need to adopt a civil religion. In the 1950s, they did this. So the Cold War, the Russians posed a threat to American identity. Nuclear arsenals were rising. Secular communism in Russia was there. America needed a unifying, non-secular front, so we adopted national deism. This is different than Christianity. We adopted national deism. So we said Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals, and Jewish people, we're going to like encompass all of your value systems, and we will say we are one nation under God, right? That motto was adopted in the 50s in opposition to the Cold War, Russia threat. The secularists, we needed a unifying religious front, but it couldn't be specifically Christian, so we adopted national deism that says, well, in God we trust. That's when it was coined and put on our money. One nation under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. In God we trust was adopted as our motto. So, and this was a unified, bipartisan response, but it was mostly suburban and mostly white. It didn't include black churches in the urban areas. But this was a unified front of we believe in God as opposed to the communist Russians. And it worked, and church attendance was probably at its national high, at the high point. And so when you hear people say we need to get back to our Christian roots, they're not pointing back to the 1800s or the 1700s, they're pointing back to 1950. because that's when we adopted those mottos. But something happened in the 60s. That was a pretty tumultuous time. I was not alive personally. But the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the sexual revolution, the unified religious front started to crack. It started to give way. And in 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory prayer in public schools was a violation of the church and state separation that kept state from establishing or endorsing a religion according to the Constitution. Also, the evangelical response to banning segregation was big. They created something called the Christian Academy. So if you've ever driven around and you've seen Christian schools, like that's a Christian school, that's a Christian academy, or they're private schools. The reason that Christians started those was because the government started to say you can't segregate anymore. We're not segregating our schools anymore. And this also is a fact for private schools. And a lot of those private schools were then, they became Christian schools, and they're like, well, we have religious freedom here to practice how we want, so we can still practice segregation. And so they were practicing segregation, and they called them segregation academies in the 60s. So that unified kind of religious front started cracking and falling apart in the 60s. A whole bunch of other stuff is happening that we don't have time for. But in the 1970s, then abortion is legalized, but also the IRS started revoking the tax-exempt status of Christian schools that still practice segregation. And the evangelical response was to say that's government overreach. That is to go back to the FDR New Deal response that the fundamentalists had back then, and saying all these big government reforms that you're doing, that's government overreach, kind of a thing. So they had it there. And they said it violates our religious freedoms to force us to segregate with black students. And a Baptist Sunday school teacher was elected president of the United States of America. His name was Jimmy Carter. But he encouraged the IRS to start cracking down on Christian schools that still illegally practice segregation, Jerry Falwell's school being one of those. He was a very huge figure in the 1970s and 80s. So Jerry Falwell does not like the crackdown of the IRS saying, no, you have to now integrate your schools. And so he starts to coalesce together all of these evangelicals. He's like, they're not politically motivated at all. Like, they don't care. I need to get everybody together, all these evangelicals together, and we need to figure out how we can mobilize politically to then get what we need enshrined in there. So he starts something called the Moral Majority right around the 1980s, and they get a surging response, and they elect President Ronald Reagan, and it was a surprise win, and it was a landslide win because all these evangelicals mobilized because of Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority, and they mobilized, and Falwell says about Ronald Reagan, he's God's instrument to bring about the kingdom of God on earth. So that's where that language starts from, is right then and there. So then more stuff happens, believe me. More stuff's happening. So, well, here we are. So segregation was no longer powerful enough to coalesce evangelical support. It actually became politically toxic. So Jerry Falwell said we need a different thing. So what could that thing be? And he ran an experiment at a midterm, and he says, let's see if we can coalesce evangelicals around the topic of abortion. And so he runs this rally, he mobilizes evangelical support, and before this moment, evangelicals were very, just Christians in general were very like, well, there's a gray area, there's lots of nuance, there's different scenarios that go in, but after this moment where Falwell rallies all this support together, it became the single issue that evangelicals voted on. And they said that abortion was, quote, an attack on family values and the traditional family. And that language there was adopted. Now, Exxon Oil millionaire's son, who was a Texas judge by the name of Paul Pressler, he met with a theologian in the 80s, late 70s probably, named Paige Patterson, and they put together a 10-year plan to take over the Southern Baptist Church, which was the largest Christian denomination of any kind in the whole nation. Maybe it was competing with Catholics, but it was huge. It was massive. And they said, we got too many modernists coming in as pastors and seminary teachers and all this stuff. So they get together and they get a 10-year plan to try and take over the Southern Baptist Church, which they do. They accomplish it right in the mid-'80s. They call it the Conservative Resurgence. And they purged all the moderates from their seminaries, from their pulpits, and they actually, even from their publishing companies and all their media outlets. And so local churches then started, they were kind of evangelical, a little fundamentalist. Then everything kind of swung fundamentalist at that point, largely because it was the largest denomination. So there was a chance, if you studied any kind of Bible study curriculum from the 80s into the mid-90s, there was an 85 to 90% chance that it was an evangelical fundamentalist Baptist bent, because they owned 85 to 90% of all the publishing companies of Christian media. If you watch something on the television, like the CBN or something, it was an 85 to 90% chance that it was going to be evangelical or fundamentalist, because they owned the media outlets. They did a 10-year takeover. If you were educated in their seminaries, they purged out all the modernists, the modernists and the moderates and all that, and they seeded everything, pastors, teachers, and media, with the conservative fundamentalist viewpoints. And so we have Pat Robertson from the 700 Club. We have James Dobson with Focus on the Family. They took advantage of these new media platforms, and they kind of expanded the fundamentalist evangelical influence. But Jerry Falwell organizes evangelicals behind this Ronald Reagan, but also nationally in the 80s. I don't know if you remember this, but there was like this occult panic that happened. Everyone was afraid of the occult, like D&D and New Age and all that like freaky stuff. So there was a whole nationwide, like you turned on Oprah or any of the talk shows and they're talking with like a Satanist, and they're like, oh yeah, we're like, we've got all these people everywhere in high positions, and we do all these weird sacrifices and stuff. That actually evolved to be the modern day QAnon conspiracy. Just a side note on that one. But fundamentalists were, again, they were pushing for big government enforcement of their morals and their values to reestablish the 1950s civil religion, to push back on the 1930s New Deal style of government. So that all happened in the 80s. Very thing. Then there was 12 years of Republican presidencies, and in the 90s, there was a lot of fatigue with the religious right, made way for the election of Bill Clinton, first Democrat in like 12 years. And that fueled fears of Christians of becoming, of the secularization of our nation again. That we're going to stray away from its Christian roots, which actually just went back to the 1950s, not all the way back to the 1700s. So that happened in the 90s, a lot of other things. The 2000s happened, Y2K, if you remember that. There was a whole conspiracy theory about Christ is going to come back on 1999, December 31st at like 11:59. All of our computers were going to crash. So there was that didn't happen. And then we have 9/11 that happened that created this fear of the outsider. And it created a temporary surge of church attendance, but shortly after that, evangelical culture starts to decline in America, feeling like those fears of becoming a secular nation once again starts feeding in. And then we have the 2010s, and what happens during this time, like most of the young people who ask questions like this, they're going to remember from this time on, not 1920s beyond. They're going to remember from this time on. So we have, in the 2010s, we have corruption after corruption after corruption coming out. The Catholic Church has their sexual abuse scandals and cover-ups. The Southern Baptist Church had hundreds of sexual abuse scandals that come out. Prominent leaders start to fall, like Robert Morris, Mark Driscoll, Carl Lentz, Bill Hybels, Ravi Zacharias, Ted Haggard, and yes, even Paul Pressler, the guy who headed up the conservative resurgence. He was actually accused and found guilty and confessed to sexual misconduct with minors. So this started to reveal cracks again in that facade of the institutional national deism, and created a sharp decline in trust of church amongst the younger generations. That's kind of how we got here. Did y'all follow that? I tried to put it in timeline format so you can just see it unfolding. So then, as you can see, like in the 80s and 90s, it was like all intertwined together, and it's starting to unravel here. So let's go back to the question. The question was, Christians in our culture / political climate are largely viewed more conservative. How can I be proud to be Christian when I do not share the views / beliefs of this group? So one, understand that American institutional deism is not reflective of Christ's life. It didn't say in Jesus we trust on our money. It says in God we trust. It's just a kind of a deistic understanding that is like, well, we have a God that we believe in, kind of a thing. But it's not necessarily Christian. It's not, one nation under Christ. Kind of that terminology was not adopted. It was a national deism. So understand, American institutional deism is not reflective of Christ's life all the time. Two, the doctrines and dogmas of American conservative Christianity are very new. They're only 100 years old. They're very reactionary to what's going on. They're not necessarily rooted in historic Christianity. And three, they're very tribal. That creates that us versus them kind of a fight that started happening in the late 1800s. So historically, the agenda of American conservative Christianity will partner with politics in order to gain power and influence in order to make the nation some kind of a religious haven. But it is important to remember that you're not baptized into a politic, you're baptized into Christ as Christians. And the Christian mission is not political. It is not let's take over the nation and cede all these places of power. That's not how it is. So we have to remember that. Because that's how we got entangled together. So we couldn't tell the difference between Christianity and politics from one another. And that caused younger people to confuse the two for one another and to say, if I'm not one, then how can I be the other? And then historically, many politicians have taken advantage of this tribalism to gain entry into Senate seats and House seats and cabinet seats and judicial seats and the presidency itself. Dating all the way back to the 1980s, that was their whole goal, to get Ronald Reagan elected. So, how can I be proud to be a Christian? There's a couple of things that we can do. One, read the words of Jesus. He said things very clearly. And sometimes what it means to be an American is in opposition to what it means to be a Christian. You have to understand the differences. And sometimes what it means to be a Christian is vice versa. So study Jesus. Don't let fundamentalist reactions to culture define your faith. Study what Jesus said, who he said it to, why he said it, and who it made angry. That's another big deal. Adopt the ways of Jesus. So the manner of Christ. Humility, gentleness, confidence, and love, all aimed at justice for your neighbor and for yourself. You adopt that manner of your life. And the third one, do the works of Jesus. Don't merely adopt ideas about Jesus. Look at how he lived, who he had compassion on, who he got angry with, why he was angry, and who killed him and for what purpose. You look at those things, and you will be able to kind of untangle faith and politics and distinguish each other from the other. Now, I tried to walk the lines and just give you the history of how it happened. There are some critiques that needed to happen in there, but that's it. So if you're a Republican, you're allowed to be a Republican and be here. If you're a Democrat, you're allowed to be a Democrat and be here. But you can't say that your politic and your faith is one thing. It just doesn't work that way. And they got entangled, and that's how we got in the mess we're in today. And I think the most important thing we can do is unravel those things and figure out the differentiations between the two, so we can live as people following Christ. And I was correct, we only had time to get to one. So, that was kind of a bigger one. But I would like to read Psalm 86 by Malcolm Guite for us all as our benediction. We have a closing hymn. I'll send us on our way. In the rich valley of the resurrection, the jubilee of God will resound, a jubilant rejoicing in perfection. But even here, the echo of that sound of perfect praise enriches our brief song, a canticle that's taken up around the world. The voices of the weak are strong in God's enduring praise. He knows their cause, and he will vindicate the poor who long to see his justice come and his good laws prevail at last. Till then, their jubilation will shake the powers that be and give them pause to tremble in the midst of exploitation and glimpse in others all the joys they've missed till love himself comes as a revelation. Psalm 66 by Malcolm Guite. Amen.
Please stand for our closing.